Okay. First of all, I'd like to say thank you to Marie-Louise, Lee, and Philippe for inviting me to this workshop and for giving me the opportunity to present one of my research projects on personalized medicine. In the paper I'm going to present now, I basically analyze disease prevention, when there are asymmetries of information in the health insurance market. So asymmetries of information between insurers and policyholders. I will not talk about moral hazard, I will just talk about adverse selection. Because, and I suppose in the paper that the adverse selection I mentioned in the title is the result of two things. First, the development of predisposition tests, which are genetic tests providing individuals with better information about the probability of developing a disease. So it provides information about the baseline probability of disease. In the model, the test will say whether people are at high risk or low risk. And two, the second reason for which there is adverse selection, but it will be due to the legal environment in which insurers operate, because we will assume that the use of genetic information for rate-making purposes is prohibited. And the question that we will raise is the following: are the benefits related to the development of predisposition tests exploited in these adverse selection equilibria, thus when there is asymmetries of information? The benefit of predisposition tests in the paper take the form of better informed decision, so better targeted prevention decision. So if the test reveals that your probability to develop a disease is high, so perhaps a good thing would be to redirect resources in order to fight this disease. So genetic testing gives an information. But the question is, do they exploit? And why could they potentially not exploit this information? Because we know that insurance and prevention decisions are related. On the other hand, in adverse selection equilibria, some agents are not, the coverage, the insurance coverage that they obtain is not optimal, okay? They would obtain more coverage in the absence of asymmetries of information in the health insurance market. So since there is a distortion in the insurance decisions, and since insurance and prevention are related, we just question the extent to which individuals use the information provided by genetic testing. So, in other words, do they, when they have the information, do they adjust their prevention decision to the newly available information? That's basically the question I will try to deal with. Let me mention a few papers on the similar topic, let's say. So the paper I'm going to mention now are all related to genetic information plus prevention, plus in this case we have moral hazard and adverse selection. So these three papers deal both with adverse selection and moral hazard. So Doherty and Posey, so they suppose that high-risk people have the opportunity to perform self-protection actions. So self-protection actions are actions reducing the probability of a loss. And they, in their paper, they establish the conditions under which information on the baseline probability of disease has a positive private value and a positive social value. If you have an information about the baseline probability of loss, on the one hand, this is beneficial because you can adjust your prevention decision, in this case, the self-protection decision, to the new information. But when you take a genetic test, you are exposed to a classification risk. And this is why it's not a given that the private value of information is positive. And this is exactly what they do. Same thing for Hull and Iverson, 2002. Also, they analyzed the economic inefficiencies in the use of genetic testing. So economic inefficiencies occur when socially optimal tests are not taken, or when socially not optimal tests are taken. And they relate this to the information provided to insurers and also to the type of insurance coverage that people have. Do they have only a compulsory health insurance, or do they supplement this compulsory insurance with a voluntary insurance? And then we have, more recently, a paper by Richard Peter, Andreas Richter, and Paul Tistel. They analyzed the welfare implication of different information regimes in the health insurance market. As I said earlier, I will just talk about the strict prohibition when insurers cannot use the information, but you have other ways to manage the information in the health insurance market. And what they find that another regime, which is the disclosure duty regime, dominates the other available regimes. And in the disclosure duty regime, basically insurers can ask policyholders to disclose the genetic test result, but they cannot require policyholders to take additional tests. And this is what they do. I hope that you confirm. Okay, thank you. Two other papers, also from people mostly present in the room. So we have David and Philippe. So they also talk about self-protection, and they define again, they talk about the value of the genetic test in relation to the efficiency of self-protection and the cost of self-protection. Okay? Mike Hoy and Lilia Filipova-Neumann, so they don't talk about self-protection, but another, let's say, prevention action, that is surveillance. So surveillance are activities increasing the probability of early detection of potential diseases. And I think perhaps you're going to talk about this paper later, but in 2 words, they analyze the welfare implications of genetic tests. And in their paper, there is a moral hazard problem because patients are covered by compulsory health systems, so they do not internalize the cost of surveillance and the cost of treatment. And so that what they show is genetic testing, even when they are costless, might decrease welfare. And I finish with 2 papers dealing only with adverse selection. We have Marie-Louise individual decision to perform a genetic test allowing informed self-insurance decision. So self-insurance is the second category of prevention actions, and it refers to the action that reduce the extent of the loss. Okay, so self-insurance actions do not modify the probability of loss, but the damage in case of loss. And they so Marie-Louise also compare different information regimes in the health insurance market, and as Peter Richter and Tistel showed, they find that the disclosure duty regime dominates the others. And then I finish with a paper that I published recently, close to what Marie-Louise and Henriet did, also on self-insurance efforts, also with no moral hazard, so only adverse selection. But instead of considering different information regimes in the health insurance market, I take the strict prohibition case. And in the strict prohibition case, I consider the different equilibria that may arise. Because Barry-Gauzy-Henri considered that in case of strict prohibition, we have the Rothschild and Stiglitz equilibrium. I will define what it is very soon. But actually, when you have adverse selection, you might have different equilibrium. Okay, and this is what I do in this previous paper. And what I will present today is an extension of this previous paper, because actually when before I published it, I tried to, I submitted my paper to health economic journals, and there was something that they didn't like in the health economic journals. And what they didn't like is the fact that in this model, diseases only have financial consequences. The assumption that I made was that in case of disease, there is a treatment, and the treatment perfectly restores health. That's an assumption. Of course, I was not pleased when they rejected me for that reason, but I had to say that it was not totally unjustified. And this is why I said, okay, when Philippe invited me in October, I said, okay, that's the opportunity to try to extend this previous paper and try to determine whether the results I obtained there are...
It's cheap talk, but I must stress I was not a referee.
Okay.
Neither was I.
The referee of the paper accepted, or the paper rejected. Bernard, you had a question?
Yeah, I have a question. Oh, sorry.
Yeah.
Somebody.
No, I thought Bernard was no. Okay.
I have a question because I was told that there is now a tendency for insurance companies to ask for all kind of genetic testing out there, even though it's not yet correlated to a particular disease, whether or not it's treatable, and the extent of the treatment that can be provided. And they have that in their database, and then the onus is on the patient to let their insurance know if the genetic test that is in their database has finally shown negative effect. And I know they do that for viruses or any contaminants and things like that. They like to know everything that was measured for a particular individual. They want that, to have that in their database. Have you saw anything of that kind?
So, are you talking about the results of genetic tests, or are you talking about other information?
Genetic tests, for one, and all the rest. I know they apply this, what I just said about genetic tests, to a lot of other things.
What I will consider here is that they cannot. Using this information is forbidden.
Okay.
And this is the regulation that applies in many countries, such as in Europe, in the US. So this is why I take this assumption. Now, the fact that they use other information, for instance, family history, is valuable information when you try to define the potential risk of a patient. I do not consider it, okay? Even though I should, it would be the next extension, perhaps. But what I will consider instead is that you start from no information at all, and then you have the information, okay? It simplifies a lot the model. So, as I said, I will consider that self-insurance actions reduce both financial and the health consequences of disease. And this is why I will work with bidimensional utility function depending on wealth and health. The difficulty when you introduce such an assumption is not that self-insurance, besides its effect on the cost, on the financial, besides its financial effect, the difficulty is not to assume that self-insurance also has an effect on health, because this is just an additional incentive to perform self-insurance action. The difficulty comes from the fact that the literature in health economics has shown that the marginal utility of wealth depends on health. And some papers, the first I mentioned here, show that the marginal utility of wealth rises with health, with the health status. So it means that an explanation might be you better enjoy an extra dollar that you have when you are in good shape. Because, for instance, you can travel, you can do many things because you are in good health state, and then you can enjoy the money that you have. And then you have other papers assuming, no, it's not that they assume, they analyzed the question and they found out the opposite, saying the marginal utility of wealth rises when your health status falls. One potential explanation might be, for instance, let's take disability. Okay, when you are disabled, this is precisely where you need the money because you have to install new equipment, etc. And then, first, we cannot a priori assume that the marginal utility of wealth rises or falls with health. And two, it modifies. So health modifies the marginal utility of wealth. But the marginal utility of wealth is what drives your insurance decision, because insurance transfers money from the no-disease state to the disease state. Now, if you change the marginal utility of money in the no-disease state and in the disease state because of this assumption, it complicates the problem. Okay, and this is in this context, I will try to answer to my question, which is: do people target their self-insurance actions when they have a genetic information? Yes.
Of those studies, Derek, isn't there new studies where they looked at lottery winners? That might be the best evidence.
New studies about the
effect of wealth on health?
You mean more recent studies?
Yeah, I think that there's this new literature, like David Sessamini and co-authors. I should know the results, but I can't remember them. There's one other one where they look at lottery winners, so you get the exogenous.
Okay, I didn't know that one, but okay, if you have.
Benedict is another one. So there's like a couple of studies where they're looking specifically at this exogenous shock income, where these other papers, they don't really solve the endogeneity problems. I just can't remember the result.
So all of them, they show that actually income improve health. They have the evidence.
So they show that
income has a positive effect on health. So it goes from income to health.
Okay, yeah, because in theory, what I said is the marginal utility of health rises or falls with health, but you have the opposite also. But the income and the marginal utility of health may rise or fall with wealth. It's exactly the same problem. Okay, but if you have these papers. One last thing, this model will be, I guess this is something you have guessed, but it will be a theoretical model. Okay, let me start with the assumptions that I make. So first, individuals maximize expected utility. Utility depends, as I said, on wealth and health, W and H, and you have a utility function which is bi-dimensional. Okay, let me introduce the notation. Here you have U1. So U1 is the marginal utility of wealth. It's the first derivative of the utility function with respect to the first argument, which is wealth. It's positive. U2 is the marginal utility of health. So the first derivative with respect to the second argument of the utility function. Okay, they are both positive, and the second derivatives, U11, U22, are negative because we assume that people are risk averse towards financial risk and health risk. Okay.
Sorry.
the definition of risk aversion only depends on the diagonal, or it will depend on the whole matrix?
Okay, I understand. So this was just risk aversion. You are talking about correlation aversion. When you see the matrix, you are talking about the cross derivatives. That's it?
I guess in the literature, you have two definitions of risk aversion according to if you only consider the diagonal, or if you consider the whole matrix.
But what do you mean by
instance,
the diagonal? It's the on the diagonal you have the second derivative with respect to the same argument.
Yeah. No, with respect to so yes, the first diagonal it's with respect to width and with respect to height.
Okay, so yeah.
But for instance, people like Baumier, who have a general utility function, when they, by risk aversion, they mean the whole matrix of the second derivative. So,
Okay. So no, the assumption that's made is just the diagonal. Okay? And it reminds me that I forgot to mention something. U12 is the cross derivative of the utility function. And so I said, okay, no assumption about the sign because the cross derivative says all the marginal utility of wealth changes with S. Okay? Okay, with the probability P, individuals develop a disease, financial and health consequences, which are denoted capital L and capital M. And in order to deal with diseases, we will suppose that agents have two instruments. Let me start with self-insurance. So self-insurance is one way to mitigate the consequences of disease, so that the capital L and capital N are written as a function of N. Okay? And the assumption is that L prime N is negative, so it simply means that when you increase your self-insurance effort, you reduce the financial consequence of the disease. And the same for N prime N, when you increase the self-insurance effort, you reduce the health consequence of the disease. The second derivative of this function, these two functions are positive, so it means that the returns of self-insurance are decreasing. So it means that your first self-insurance efforts are very efficient. They reduce quite a lot the health and financial consequences of the disease, but the following actions have less impact. And N, so, is the intensity of self-insurance action, and the cost of self-insurance is supposed to be constant. Okay? Self-insurance actions include programs allowing early detection of diseases onset and thus more effective treatments, such as the use of mammograms or colonoscopy. So it's one form of surveillance, except that in your paper about surveillance, increasing surveillance increases the probability that you detect early a disease. In this case, once you perform the self-insurance action, it detects the disease. Okay? Increasing in its intensity may be, for instance, increasing the frequency with which you perform these surveillance actions. That's the first instrument. And then we have another instrument, which is insurance, because insurance contracts are sold by perfectly competitive insurance companies. Okay, so it will just mean in the model that insurance companies do not make profit. And a critical assumption is that self-insurance actions can be observed by insurance companies, so that the contracts are contingent on the intensity of self-insurance. That's a critical assumption because, of course, all the prevention actions cannot be observed by insurers. But if you consider surveillance, for instance, you can show to your insurer that you perform self-insurance actions.
But to me, it's not a strong assumption because, in fact, most of the time, insurers pay for reimburse the secondary prevention. So in your model, do you allow insurers to reimburse the cost of the secondary prevention? Or?
No. No. The insurers do not pay the prevention. Insurers just pay something which is random. If they, in the model they do not pay something which is that you decide. But okay, this is something I could assume. What they do is if you perform the self-insurance action, then your insurance premium falls. Okay, but they don't pay the action at the cost of the action itself. Okay? Yeah?
And also the timing of your model is that you choose the intensity of self-insurance before the risk is resolved, right?
Yeah. So what
because
you choose...
what you're thinking is something that you do if you get sick, right?
No, not necessarily. If you do a mammography, well, you know. If you do a mammography, you will be reimbursed. So you don't need secondary prevention, but you are not willing to pay.
Because here the financial cost, like the L, is decreasing in N, right?
Hmm?
But it's the cost of treating.
Yeah. It's not the, David's question was...
It's less costly to treat it in a sense.
Because you catch it early.
Yeah, okay.
So it means that what insurers sell to policyholders is a contract that defines, of course, the coverage, but also the self-insurance action. The contract specifies the self-insurance action. Since they know the self-insurance action, they know the extent of the loss, and then you have, so for instance, the insurance indemnity is equal to the cost of the treatment, something that they can observe, times A. And A is the insurance coverage, A being included between 0 and 1. Okay, but so the contract that you buy specifies the self-insurance action that you will have to perform. The insurance premium, capital R, is equal to the insurance indemnity times R, small r, which is the insurance price or the cost per euro covered. Okay? When R is equal to P, the probability of disease, we say that the contracts are actuarial. Okay. Yeah, actuarially fair. Yeah. Okay, that's all. Then you have a genetic test, which is perfect and costless. This is a predisposition test. And we will assume that insurers do not know the individual's informational status. So it means that as an individual, you cannot prove to your insurer that you didn't take the test. Okay? So that, and this is a paper by Dorothy and Tistel, the test is taken in this case. And the test sorts the population into two groups, the high risk group and the low risk group. So pH is the probability of disease of the high risk group. People in the low risk group have a probability of disease PL, and the first group represents the proportion lambda of the population. Yeah.
Although the insurers cannot observe whether you took the test or not, they know that at Equilibrium everybody takes the test.
Yeah.
And they know that everybody is informed and knows this.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. There will be no contracts for the uninsured,
Yeah.
because they know that nobody will
Which is the difference with what
Yeah.
I present tomorrow.
That's good news. We are not going to present this.
Yeah, no, because you told me from the titles the papers would be closed. Not that close.
Okay, and the average probability of disease is PM, which is simply 1 minus lambda times PL plus lambda times PH. Okay, last piece of information about that. Last assumption, the adverse selection equilibria, because we will consider three types of three equilibria that will depend on two things. So we will have 4 situations and 3 equilibria. So the kind of equilibrium you obtain depends on how insurers make profit and the proportion of high risk in the population. If we suppose that insurers make non-negative profits on each contract, so each time they sell a contract, the constraint is that they make no losses on each contract, and if the proportion of high risk is sufficiently high, we have a Rothschild and Stiglitz equilibrium. Otherwise, if so non-negative profits on each contract and the proportion of high risk is low or below this threshold, we have another contract which is the Wilson pooling equilibrium. And then we have the other way to make profit. So instead of making profit on each contract, insurers may make negative profits, losses on some contract, as long as they are counterbalanced by the profit that they made on other contracts. Okay? So that in the second case, we allow some cross-subsidization between contracts. Okay? And in that case, we have, again, the Rothschild and Stiglitz equilibrium if lambda is sufficiently high, and another equilibrium, which is the Miyazaki and Spence equilibrium if lambda is sufficiently low. Now, let me explain what are the consequences of these 4 situations, because this is crucial, of course, because I will analyze self-insurance decision in these 4 cases. You see that the Rothschild and Stiglitz is something that you find as long as the proportion of high risk is sufficiently high. Let me start with non-negative profits on each contract. This is the Wilson pooling equilibrium. Pooling in the sense that everybody buys the same contract. If everybody buys the same contract and if insurers have to make non-negative profits, and if there is since there is competition, the profit that they make is equal to 0, so it means that the price of the contract will depend on PM, which is the average probability of disease. So everybody buys a contract based on the average probability of disease. That's the Wilson pooling equilibrium. Now, and this is something that you can reach if the proportion of high risk is sufficiently low. If the proportion of high risk is higher than a threshold, you have the Rothschild and Stiglitz separating equilibrium. This is a separating equilibrium because policyholders do not buy the same contract. And actually you have 2 contracts. A contract designed for the high-risk people and a contract designed for the low-risk people. Of course, if you offer these contracts and if you offer a full coverage, nobody will buy the expensive contract. Okay, the high-risk people will say, okay, I'm a low-risk person, I buy the low-risk contract, and so insurers make losses. So that in order to give incentives to high-risk people to buy their contract, the contract that is designed for them, what insurers do is that they, for the low-risk people, so those who are buying the less expensive contract, they say, okay, if you want to buy the less expensive contract, I have to reduce your insurance coverage. And this is why we have, at the Rothschild and Stiglitz equilibrium, the contract that the insurance premium are based on the true probability of disease, PH for the for the high risk, PL for the low risk, and high risk people obtain the full insurance coverage, while low risk people obtain only the partial insurance coverage. That's the Rothschild and Stiglitz equilibrium. Now, if we suppose that insurers make non-negative profits not on each contract but on the average contract, what they might do, they could say to the, start from the Rothschild and Stiglitz equilibrium, they could say to the low-risk people, okay, for the moment, what you have is a contract which is not expensive because it is based on your probability of disease, which is low, but you obtain only a partial coverage? What if I offer you a higher coverage, but of course, if I offer a higher coverage, you will have to pay more, because otherwise you will attract high-risk people. And this is why, at the Miyazaki-Spence equilibrium, high-risk people obtain full insurance, low-risk people obtain partial insurance, but they don't pay a premium which is based on the true probability of disease. And typically, low-risk people pay a little bit more than an insurance premium based on the low probability of disease, and high-risk people pay a little bit less than a premium based on the probability of disease. Okay, so I'm not sure that I will have the time to analyze the self-insurance action in all this contract, but at least it shows what I try to do. Yeah.
I just want to make a little comment about your last statement. I would say that I would, like, if you have a very small fraction of very high risk types,
Yeah.
and everybody else is much lower risk,
Yeah.
which I think is quite typical of,
Sure.
at least monogenetic diseases.
Yeah.
Then I would just change your last descriptor a little bit by saying the low risk types pay a little bit higher than their true risk, and the high risk types pay a lot less than their true risk.
Okay.
So, and the reason I say that is because you get more effective targeting of implicit redistribution from the good risks to the bad risks in that scenario, whereas it's not true for the others.
Okay. Yeah, sure. And of course, genetic diseases have this specificity. You have a very small fraction of people who have a high risk.
So from a utilitarian's perspective, they like that outcome.
Mm-mm.
From an efficiency perspective, it's still inefficient.
Yeah, because here I just said that low-risk people obtain partial coverage, but I didn't say that what they obtain is 50% of, and it might be very high and very close to 100%.
I'll discuss this.
Yeah. Okay, fine.
So, Donald?
Yeah.
So if you have binary utility, you still have single crossing and difference curves, right?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. Okay. Individual make insurance and self-insurance decisions, so genetic tests are not available. Now I'm going to try to explain how people make self-insurance decision, and I start when they don't have the information. Okay? There is no genetic information, and when there is no genetic information, it means that everybody is starts from the same position. So, as I said, when you have no information, you do not consider other variables. Everybody thinks that his or her probability of disease is PM, the average probability of disease. And then you have the equilibrium, which is defined by the values of A, the insurance coverage, and self-insurance action, and R, which is the price of insurance. That maximizes this expected utility. So you have, with the probability 1 minus PM, people are healthy. If they are healthy, this is their wealth level, and this is their health status. The wealth level is W, initial wealth, minus what they pay for the self-insurance action, minus the insurance premium. And their health state is H. They are sick with the probability PM. Okay, in that case, the wealth level is W minus what they pay for the self-insurance action, minus the insurance premium, minus for those who do not buy the full insurance contract, so for those whose A is lower than 1, minus the out-of-pocket payment. Okay? And in this case, we have the health state is equal to H minus M, which is the health consequence of the disease. Okay? And we have two constraints. A must be included between 0 and 1. And this constraint says that insurers cannot make negative profits. But this will be easily solved because since I assume perfect competition, R is equal to PM. So that we have the following problem. So this is the expected utility. This is the constraint. And you see here that the only thing I've changed is that now I consider that the price of insurance depends on PM, the average probability of disease. And this is what you have. And then you have 3 first-order conditions. Okay, we'll try not to be too technical. Simply, first consider that you have an interior solution, so that you don't have a corner solution. So in this case, it means that A is lower or equal to 1, but when A is equal to 1, it's not a constraint, it's not because of the constraint, that's the choice, and then I will explain when this occurs. Okay, when you have an interior solution, beta is equal to 0, and what the first order condition simply says is that the marginal utility of wells in the no disease case must be equal to the marginal utility of wells in the disease case, okay? And then you have the second order condition with respect to N, the intensity of self-insurance. Actually, what does self-insurance changes? So, first, you pay for it. So it reduces your wealth in both cases, okay? That's a cost. And then you have the first advantage, because when you increase your self-insurance action, your insurance premium falls. Okay, so you pay a lower insurance premium in both cases. And then you have 2 additional advantages. The first is that, and these 2 additional advantages occur in the disease case, because you reduce the extent of the financial loss, and this matters if your A is not equal to 1, and then you reduce the extent of your of the else consequence. Okay? And what I have explained is exactly what you have here in the first order condition. You have all these effects. Something that is important is that I said, okay, the 2 last advantages are that you reduce the financial consequences and you reduce the else consequences, but you weight these 2 advantages by the probability that you are sick. Okay, you weight these 2 advantages by PM. Okay, and something interesting is that when you use these 2 equations together, we obtain this. Actually, everything simplifies. And here I just look at the self-insurance decision. So this is what I will call the self-insurance decision rule. And you see that the self-insurance decision rule is the same when you have an interior solution. Okay? When you have a corner solution, it is slightly different. I will explain why. But first, look at the self-insurance decision rule. Simply what it says is that when you make your self-insurance decision, you consider the cost of self-insurance. You consider, that's the financial benefit of self-insurance. It reduces, don't forget that this is negative, it reduces the financial consequence of the disease, and you weight this reduction by the probability of disease, PM. So that's the financial effect of self-insurance. And here you have the else effect of self-insurance. With the probability PM, you reduce the else consequence of the disease. So you have a financial effect and an else effect. And these 2 effects, and this is what makes the analysis complicated compared to the first paper. These 2 effects are weighted for the first, I'm just here talking about financial consequences. this effect is weighted by the marginal utility of wealth, and since this second effect is, I'm talking about else consequences, this is weighted by the marginal utility of else. Okay? What's interesting is that when I computed first my first order condition, you see that it depended on A. In this case, you see that combining the two first order conditions, you see that A disappears. It doesn't disappear totally because A will have an impact on BM. Okay? And so it will have an impact on the marginal utility of wealth and on the marginal utility of wealth. But at least you show that in the decision rule, when you weight the benefits and the cost of self-insurance, A does not appear anymore in the self-insurance decision rule. Let me now try to explain intuitively why we do obtain this self-insurance decision rule. And to do it, I will consider the simplest problem. And the simplest problem is the one I dealt with in the previous paper, is when you have a uni-dimensional utility function. So no else consequences. And then we will progress towards the result that I have just displayed. So, no else consequences. Insurance, so you have insurance and self-insurance. Insurance is available at fair odds. Okay? So, insurance available at fair odds reallocates wealth from the no-disease state to the disease state. And it does so at no cost. But I know cost, I mean no extra, no additional cost, because the premium is based on the probability of disease. Okay? So it means that the redistribution through insurance leaves unchanged the expected wealth. So this is a pure redistribution effect. And this is why risk-averse people like insurance, and they purchase full insurance contract. This is the old result by Moussi. Okay, that's for insurance. Now let me consider self-insurance. Actually, self-insurance plays the same role as insurance. It also redistributes wealth from the no-disease state to the disease state. Okay, but the difference it's that this redistribution is not modifies the expected wealth. And this is due to the decreasing returns of self-insurance. Okay? Because, as I said, the first units of self-insurance are very efficient. Okay? While when you perform your 10th or 11th self-insurance action, the effect on the loss is less strong. Okay? So it means that the first units of self-insurance redistribute wealth to the non-disease, from the no-disease to the disease case, while increasing expected utility. And from this point, so beyond that point, self-insurance redistributes wealth, but it reduces the expected wealth. So that the best thing to do is to use self-insurance. If you are risk-averse, the best thing to do is to use self-insurance as long as it redistributes wealth between the two states and increase the expected wealth. Once you reach that point, then you use insurance, because insurance redistributes wealth, but does not modify the expected wealth. Okay? And this is why in this in the first order condition for self-insurance, what I call the self-insurance decision rule, if you cancel this term because you just consider wealth and no health, you have this. So this must be equal to 0 in 3 cases, and this is exactly what I have here. Okay? So that's the decision rule. When there is no health, diseases have no effect on on else. Okay? And graphically, simply it means that you start from this point, so in the x-axis you have wells in the no-loss case, and here you have wells in the loss case. Okay? You start from this point, you would like to go there. Okay? You would like to have wells in the no-loss case and in the loss case. But self-insurance and insurance offer the opportunity to go in this direction. Okay? And when you use insurance along this straight line, it means that the marginal and the expected wealth remains unchanged. So first, the best thing to do is to start with self-insurance, and from this point, instead of continuing with self-insurance, you choose insurance, and if you are risk averse, you go to that point, which is the diagonal, because you are risk averse, insurance is available at fair odds, and you fully insure. Yeah.
Why is the slope the same for two lines? Because when you insure, you decrease your risks. So.
Here and there?
Yeah.
No, but you don't change the marginal rate.
Oh yeah, it's
the marginal rate of substitution, which is constant.
No, it's well, secondary. I mean, you don't decrease your probability. You decrease the extent of the loss. That's explained. Okay.
It will be tomorrow.
Yeah, that's your.
Sorry.
Okay. Now that's the simplest case. Now let's take another case, which is bidimensional utility function this time, but with assuming that self-insurance has no impact, does not reduce the health consequence of the disease. M prime n is equal to 0. Okay? Self-insurance just reduces the financial consequences of disease, not the health consequences. Okay? And in this case, we have the following insurance demand. The insurance demand depends on my U12 term, the sign of U12. It depends on how the marginal utility of wealth changes with health. Specifically, if the marginal utility of wealth does not change with health, okay? In this case, you demand full insurance. But if, let's suppose that the marginal utility of wealth rises with health, so it means that you prefer an additional dollar when you are in good state, in good health state, rather than when you are in the bad health state. So it means that you will not fully insure. You will prefer to keep this extra dollar. You will prefer not to pay the premium, saying, okay, perhaps your reimbursement, your indemnity will be lower, but this is my trade-off. I prefer keeping my wealth when I'm in a good health state. So this is less than full coverage if the marginal utility of wealth rises with health. And you have the opposite, of course, when the marginal utility of wealth falls with the health state. People would like to buy more than full insurance if they can. In my paper, it's not allowed, but if they can, they would buy more than full insurance. They would over-insure because they would like to have more money when they are in bad health state. So now, what you have in this case, back to my pre-self-insurance conditions, but if m prime n is equal to 0, this disappears, this disappears, this disappears, and you have actually that you are left with only this term, okay, equal to 0, so it means that you have exactly the same self-insurance decision rule, which is this one, okay? So it means that when diseases have an impact on health, okay? But when the self-insurance action does not reduce this health consequence, the self-insurance decision rule is simply the same, okay? If I go back to my figure, simply, because the choice that you make between insurance and self-insurance remains unchanged. Again, you would like to go there. You have the opportunity to go there. Okay, you choose self-insurance up to that point, and then insurance But if U12 is equal to 0, you stop here. If U12 is positive, you stop here. If U12 is negative, and if you can buy over insurance, you go there. Okay? But it doesn't change where you should stop. Where you should stop is exactly at the same point, which is as long as self-insurance increases my expected wealth, I take self-insurance, and then I choose insurance. Okay? Last case, which is the case that I discuss in the paper. Bidimensional utility function and self-insurance has an impact on health. It reduces the health consequence of the disease. Then we have something more complicated. But what you do actually is, because in this case you have self-insurance as a financial effect and a health effect. And so the financial effect is the one I've just mentioned, and then the health effect is this one. And what you do simply is to weight the financial effect and the health effect by the marginal utility of wealth and by the marginal utility of health. And this is why we end up with this condition. One last thing, why do we have 3 different conditions? Now, these are not, actually I don't have 3 different conditions, but this one looks slightly different. It's simply because when U12 is positive, you would like to buy full insurance, okay? But you cannot. You cannot buy full insurance. So it means that in your insurance decision here, you cannot make this and this equal because of the constraint. So if this and this is not equal, the marginal utility of wealth in the disease case and the marginal utility of wealth in the no disease case are not the same. And this is why here the financial consequences of self-insurance are weighted by an expected marginal utility of wealth. Okay? This is because we have a corner solution. Why in these 2 cases? Because the optimal insurance decision is taken, then the marginal utility of wealth in the 2 states are the same, and so that this simplifies. Okay, if U1A is equal to U1B, then you can write this as being equal to U1B, as I write here, or U1A. Okay.
15 minutes.
15.
Yeah.
Before the questions or before the end?
Before the end.
I'm sorry. Too long. Because now I must talk about
Adverse
the information. Adverse selection. Look, I'm going to do the following. There are 2 ways to present the paper. I define the optimum here, and then try to find whether the optimum is reached in all these adverse selection equilibria. I'm not going to do this, okay? I will just say, okay, do we use, the way I presented my paper at the very beginning of the talk, I say, okay, do we use the information? Before talking about adverse selection, one word about the laissez-faire case. If the insurance companies are allowed to ask policyholders to disclose the genetic test results, when you compute the equilibrium, you have, for self-insurance, you have these 2 conditions. And as you can see, perhaps this is not clear, but the I here is equal to L and H. So in this case, people have the information, okay? People who are at low risk know that they are at low risk. People who are at high risk know that they are at high risk, okay? And what occurs at the laissez-faire, in the laissez-faire case is when, for instance, when if U12 is higher or equal to 0, you see here that they weight the financial effect of self-insurance by, if you are low risk, by PL, and the health effect of self-insurance is weighted by PL also. So it means that you use at the laissez-faire regime, you use the genetic information because you weight these financial and health consequences of self-insurance by your true probability of disease. Now, and I start with adverse selection, consider the pooling equilibrium. So in the pooling equilibrium, I remind you that the people buy the same contract, which is based on the average probability of disease. So, and in this case, the insurance choice is made by low-risk people. Okay? So low-risk and high-risk people will simply buy the same. So this is the expected utility of low-risk people, knowing that they know that they are at low risk, okay? But they pay the average insurance premium, okay? The insurance premium depends on PM. They would like to say to the insurer, I am a low risk, insurance cannot take this information. Okay, and then I compute the equilibrium, and now you will have to believe me, but so you have a new insurance decision, and what you have is the following. This is the self-insurance decision rule. Financial effect of self-insurance, health effect of self-insurance, but you see now that the financial effect of self-insurance is weighted not by PL. This is a decision taken by the low-risk agent, and the low-risk agent knows that he is a low-risk agent. Despite this, the way he or she weights the financial benefit of self-insurance and the way he or she weights the health benefit of self-insurance is by PM, the average probability of disease, which is quite surprising. They have the information. They know that they are high risk, but the decision is such, the insurance decision is such that it modifies the marginal utility of wealth in the disease case and in the non-disease case, and you have this. Okay? So here, typically, we have a situation where people do not use the genetic information when making self-insurance decision. Okay? Now, quickly, the separating equilibrium, Rothschild and Stiglitz. I explained earlier this market equilibrium. So everybody pays an insurance premium depending on his or her true risk. Low-risk people obtain a partial insurance contract. High-risk people obtain a full insurance contract. Okay, and the constraint is that when you offer contracts to low-risk and high-risk people, you must be sure that high-risk people prefer their contract. So this is the contract, their expected utility at the laissez-faire equilibrium. Okay, they say to the insurer, okay, I'm a high risk, give me the high risk contract, full insurance, but I pay more, but I obtain full insurance. Okay, the contract that you offer to the low risk people must be such that the high risk people prefer their contract rather than the contract offered to low risk people. And so you maximize this, so you have the constraint, etc. I just give you the final result. You will have to believe me, or you will have to read the paper that I sent to Lee. What you have here is that for the low-risk people, again, the self-insurance decision rule has the same form. You always have the financial effect, the health effect of self-insurance, but here you see that low-risk people, despite the fact that they do not obtain the full insurance coverage, they weight the financial loss and they weight it's not the financial loss, they weight the financial effect of self-insurance and they weight the health effect of self-insurance by PL, the true probability of disease. So at the Rothschild and Stiglitz equilibrium, the information is exploited. Okay, and let me finish with the Miyazaki-Spence equilibrium. So here, people, so high-risk people have what they pay, the insurance premium they pay, is lower than the true insurance premium. True in the sense, in the actuarial sense. Okay, they get full coverage. Low risk people pay more than the insurance premium they would pay at the laissez-faire. Okay, and they obtain partial coverage. The problem is the following. Okay, so here we have the constraint, and the final result is that, but look, this is what low risk people do, this is what high risk people do. They weight the financial effect of self-insurance and they weight the health effect of self-insurance by the true probability of disease. So it means that, to summarize, and that will be my last word, at the Miyazaki-Spence equilibrium, and this is the same at the Rothschild and Stiglitz equilibrium, the information is exploited. People use the information when making the self-insurance decision. That's not the case at the pooling equilibrium, because at the pooling equilibrium, they behave as if they didn't have the information.
So when you say they use the information, you mean that PL appears in the first order condition. But does it mean, I mean, there is a difference in the amount of prevention that you are doing? They're not doing the...
Exactly, perfectly right. And this is why, finally, I end up with some clear-cut results. What I have just said. Now, and this is something I try to do, if you try to compare what people do, because the problem is that the value of pH for the wealth of that the high-risk people have at the Rothschild and Stiglitz equilibrium, at the pooling equilibrium, at the laissez-faire equilibrium is not the same. And so it modifies this, and there is nothing that you can compare. So I'm not saying here that in some cases they do more insurance or more self-insurance or less. The only thing I'm able to say is that they use the information or not.
But can you do as you did for the symmetric information part of the paper, where you simplify the model, you take away things, and in that case you can maybe order the prevention efforts, and then you introduce one element at a time and see where you can go?
So yeah, well, okay, no, but that's a good suggestion, because if, so for instance, as I did in my explanation, if you simplify a little bit and you say, okay, else, diseases have health consequences, but let's suppose that self-insurance does not modify the health consequences of disease. Okay, so this is this case. Anyway, so if you suppose that you have this equal to 0, so it means that the self-insurance decision will be equal. So at the pooling equilibrium, it will be equal to, this is equal to 0. At the laissez-faire, Rothschild, Stiglitz, Miyazaki-Spence, you will have that the self-insurance decision will be this, except that you will change the probability of disease here in the decision rule by the true probability of disease. And in that case, you will order the intensity of self-insurance at the different equilibria that you have.
Okay. Here you have two countervailing effects. There's the probability is changing on the left side and on the right-hand side. Okay.
But yeah, because simply when you compare what happens at the Rothschild Stiglitz and at the Miyazaki-Spence, you have things changing on the right-hand side, but also here. So everything changes. It's difficult to try to order the intensity of the effort. The only thing you can do is, okay, suppose this is equal to 0, this disappears, this is always positive, so this is equal to 0, and things become simple.
But you also have a very nice separability result that even if whatever the value of A, even if you have under coverage, it doesn't impact your incentive to do prevention. Because the difference between the pooling equilibrium with symmetric information and with asymmetric information is in the first case you get full coverage, in the other case you get partial coverage.
Exactly. Yeah.
But it doesn't bother you because it's totally separable.
Yeah. Totally. Yeah, Richard.
And so I think another thing that might be interesting, if you, like, you said the health economics journals were complaining about the fact that correlation preferences is something that matters. So instead of trying to compare effort choices across regimes, you could start, like you do a comparison within regime, where you start with zero effectiveness in the health state and introduce a little effectiveness at the margin, because that would allow you to say something about how correlation preferences
affects
change. Exactly. So I think that might be, maybe that's
one way to start. Let's
maybe
say
something to explore.
Then going on with that discussion, and I think this is a question I should have asked you very, very beginning of your presentation. How do you think that it would change your model if you introduce two types of goods? Because I really, for me, this preference correlation really depends on the type of good you consider, and exactly as you took as an example in the beginning, if you consider traveling or medical expenses, then you should expect that it varies very much with your health.
Sure.
And that's a bit of those. So I really, in general, I don't really understand this debate about whether the cross correlation in preferences is positive or negative, because it really depends on how you model those things. And so, for instance, you could really have a model where you have two types of goods, and then, so what I'm suggesting is a bit different from what you did. You would have separable utility with the utility of going traveling, the utility of medical expenses, and then you would have different cross correlations, and then you could just see how efforts would vary depending on those
the type of good
that you consider, and so you would have one budget constraint, or so exactly the same model, but the utility would be a bit different.
This is.
And
I don't. This is something I should try at least.
I understand this is a different model than what you did, but I think that what I would believe is that you simply would have to introduce two types of good instead of those different cases depending on the cost correlations.
Else plus another good, which could be traveling, for instance, and
So if you have this comment from a referee, it's so
I know.
You know that it would be, but you did not have it.
So we still have time for one or two more questions.
Just thinking another comparative stack exercise, which may work or may not, it may crash and burn, but I just thinking about it, is that PM is a function of lambda. And so if you just look at a solution, think about the value functions of both types, and then totally differentiate with respect to lambda, to see how things change within a regime. Like, I have either the pooling or the separating or cross-subsidizing and exact expense equilibrium. Because it could be, the envelope there might have.
In the same regime, increasing
when. So then you just say, well, because this is of interest in genetic testing, right? There are some genetic tests where lots of people have the gene. By lots, I mean maybe 5 or 10% of the population, but a lot of them are 1 in 1,000. So.
Thank you. This is something I should try definitely.
Might be too
You do that now.
Is there empirical evidence on the cross utility derivative in health and wealth? I guess there is.
And there is no consensus. This is what there is no consensus because the empirical evidence suggests that it might go in those directions. I mean, it can be positive, it can be negative.
It's presumably disease specific.
Yeah, this is disease specific. Yeah, it depends. Is it mild or minor? Or, yeah.
Well, if you get very old and you get some kind of Alzheimer's disease, probably the utility of consumption is not very high.
Probably.
Last question.
Yeah, some comparative statics results might be interesting also here. We're just thinking of, for instance, it's an area where there's a lot of technological breakthroughs, and, for instance, the effectiveness of self-insurance change and so on.
But actually, and this is related to Philippe's question, my question, because Philippe said, okay, can you, for instance, order self-insurance? And I said no, because there are too many effects going in different directions, so that I'm not sure that if the only question I can provide an answer to is this one. Now, if I introduce comparative statics, but at least I should try. I agree, but I am very pessimistic because there are too many. There is the insurance decision, the prevention decision, which depends on the marginal utility of wealth and health. Well, okay, this is something I could assume, for instance, that U12 is positive, but despite this, I'm not sure that I would. But it doesn't mean that I should not try.
Okay, I think it's time to thank you first.